Detroit, from grace to grass. Weep not for Detroit, but only a stone-hearted and callous observer would not sympathize with the largest city in Michigan if he knows the city's past glory. Alas, Detroit has descended from grace to grass since the last few decades. This video will show you how and why Detroit moved from grace to grass. When the going was good. Detroit used to be a thriving, buzzing city in the early 20th century. The big city, sprawling 139 square miles, about 10 times bigger than Manhattan in New York that is just 22 square miles, was the fourth largest city in the US in the 1940s. However, that had been the case since 1850. For 150 years, Detroit had always counted among the top 20 most populous cities in the United States. The 1950 census gave the city's population figure as over 1.8 million. Thus, the city was historically a major population center. This was partly due to the thriving automobile industry there. The city was then gracious, glorious, and populous. Without the aid of history, those born within the last 3 decades in modern Detroit could never imagine how the city fell from grace to grass. Today, the city's story is all about how it could bounce back and rise from grass to grace. The urban decay. The city is currently not doing well in all metrics. The economy of the city is on a downward spiral. The crime rate is one of the highest in the country, even though it has reduced in the 21st century. Worse still, it has gone through a major demographic decline. The vast majority of the city areas are in a severe state of urban decay. Now let's talk further a bit about this before exploring the reasons that have been advanced for the sordidness of the city-state. The evidence of urban decay is seen everywhere in Detroit. This is the process through which a formerly flourishing and properly functioning city gradually falls into disrepair and eventual disuse and desolation. Such cities usually have a lot of empty plots of land and many plots whose buildings have been abandoned or become decrepit. Other common indicators of urban decay in a city are high unemployment and crime rates, as such cities usually become dens of criminals rather than hubs of commercial activities. This picture perfectly illustrates what Detroit has turned into. It has become the most commonly referred to example of urban decay in America. If you are in many parts of this city, you would think you are in uncultivated farmland. Other visitors could argue that they're in an urban prairie, while some would see a complete wilderness. I would resist the temptation to call it a ghost town in some hours of the day. But why the fall? But the question is, how come the once flourishing city of Detroit descended from grass to grace? One reason is economic decline. In 2013, when Detroit filed its municipal bankruptcy case, it was the largest in U.S. history. Though the data slightly improved in 2014, the situation got thinkers wondering about the history of the city's economy. The automobile industry was the nucleus of the city's economic activity before the 1950s. Starting from then, however, the industry was no longer confined to Detroit due to the market expansion and other factors, such as location and localization of industries. Though Detroit remained, at least for a while, the center of the industry, many jobs left the city. Globalization did more bashing to Detroit than to any other city in the United States. The next thing in the sequence of things in a deindustrialized city is a continuous loss of jobs. In turn, a city with fewer job opportunities would experience massive emigration. Every subsequent census has recorded a decrease rather than an increase in population. Thus, the city of 1.8 million residents in 1950 had decreased to just 700,000 residents in 2010, over 60% decrease in just 60 years. What a great population dip! In addition to the deindustrialization of Detroit, the phenomenon of white flight also dealt a great blow to the city. During the white flight phenomenon, many white families fled the urban areas of Metro City Detroit to the suburbs and outskirts of the city. This was a fallout of the Great Migration that occurred in the 1940s and 1950s. In a desperate search for employment, hundreds of thousands of blacks from the South thronged Detroit. The migration resulted in overcrowding in the inner city and subsequent racial discrimination that gave rise to housing segregation. For that reason, there were incidents of redlining, racial mortgage discrimination, and restrictive covenants in Detroit. This caused certain minority groups to reside in certain subsections of Detroit, such as Black Bottom, As expected, many of the white Detroiters didn't want to integrate with their black neighbors. Rather than coexist peacefully, the whites often chose to flee Detroit center and settle in nicer, racially homogeneous neighborhoods. In search of a greener pasture, some black families also left such a deserted area. An increased desire for home ownership also played a role. While black families struggled with discrimination in the real estate market and found it tough to access home loans, white families were having free rides here. So they were in a better position to own homes and relocate to wherever they liked. Perceived racial discrimination. The post-World War II Reconstruction also took its toll on the city and contributed to the white flight. When the interstate highway system was constructed, it made it easier for white families to commute. This provided another incentive for other white Detroiters who had earlier been tolerant of their black counterparts to relocate. Racial segregation had the houses of black pulled down to make ways for highways. Those houses were said to have been built on ghettos underfinanced and undermaintained. This further decimated the city. In response to such discrimination, there were a lot of riots in Detroit. Those several riots dealt a devastating blow on the glory of the city of Detroit. Destructive riots in Detroit. One of these was the Detroit Race Riot of 1943. For 3 good days in June 1943, federal troops lost control of the city as blacks and whites were at war, which began in Detroit's largest park, Belle Isle. By the time the riot was quelled on June 24, 1943, some 34 individuals have been killed. 433 have been wounded, while property valued at $2 million have been destroyed. This introduced racial tension and animosity amongst blacks and whites, which caused more riots. From Belle Isle to all over Paradise Valley, fierce attacks were launched against the properties of each other. There were lootings of the properties between black and white on both sides. The handling of those riots by police authorities didn't help the matter. Detroit police appeared to be sympathizing with white protesters, especially during that riot at Belle Isle. This was an example of systemic racist attitudes against blacks during the post-war period. The fragile amalgam continued in an atmosphere of suspicion where there were pockets of riots now and then until 1955, when there was another major riot. It was sparked by the decision of the family of Black Wilson to buy a home in a neighborhood that was predominantly whites. They faced serious harassment, vandalism, threats of eviction, among others. The year 1967 saw another serious 5 days of riots in Detroit. This led to the death of 43 people composed of 33 black and 10 white. The number of injured was 467, among whom were 182 civilians, 16 state police officers, 17 National Guard troops, and 3 U.S. Army soldiers. The affected stores, either looted or burned, were 2,509, and 388 families were rendered homeless and became internally displaced. Some 412 buildings were torched or vandalized enough to be fit only for demolition. Losses from these arsons and lootings cost anywhere from $40 million to $80 million. Politician Coleman Young, Detroit's first black mayor, noted that even though those riots claimed many lives, the greatest casualty was the city itself. Was he correct? You don't need to be a demographer to understand what toll those riots would have taken on the city. If you were a Detroiter, would you love to leave your family in a city with incessant riots, low economic activity, and insecurity? Your answer is as good as anybody's guess. The exodus was prodigiously steady. A total of 22,000 left in 1966. In 1968, it was 82,000, while it was 46,000 in 1969. During the 1970s and 1980s, Detroit's situation had deteriorated enough to be named the arson capital of America and the murder capital of America. On the crime statistics released by the FBI, Detroit is frequently listed among the most dangerous cities in the U.S. This is caused by a lot of abandoned buildings that have become hideouts for drug traders, arsonists, and other criminals. No wonder crime rates in Detroit in 1991 peaked at 2,700 crimes per 100,000 residents. Consequent economic tolls and efforts towards recovery. The population decline led to a decline in the city's tax revenue. As the government was receiving less and less revenue, the result was more and more foreclosures and overall unemployment. The services are also getting poorer with its attendant issues. This explains the bankruptcy of 2013. In a nutshell, the narrative about how Detroit fell from grace to grass can be put on the feet of factory closings, urban renewal, segregation, and race riots. However, all hope is not lost on Detroit. Is there any reason to believe that the city will rise from grass to grace? Yes, there seems to be a bright light at the end of the tunnel. Mike Duggan, the mayor of the city since 2014, has made different moves to attract business and individuals back to Detroit. And the city is recently witnessing some movement of people back there. Detroit is now being referred to as America's comeback city. If you love this video, please don't forget to click the like button. Kindly share and remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more.